On 7 July 1945, inside the Kremlin war room, Joseph Stalin stood alone by the map wall, listening to reports that sounded different than before. The men who had buried fear behind silence, who measured victory in factories and graves, felt a shift as numbers arrived from the front. It was not a battlefield miracle or a sudden collapse of morale, but an industrial truth emerging from intelligence briefings. Germany, bled white in steel and fuel, could no longer replace its tanks. And Stalin understood what that meant. In Moscow that night, under yellow lamps and cigarette smoke, he remembered 1941, when factories fled east and survival felt impossible. Now the balance had reversed. The Red Army burned through German armor, while Soviet plants rolled machines forward, day and night. Stalin said little aloud, but aides saw his eyes narrow as he traced supply arrows and imagined Berlin without steel. This realization did not promise mercy, it promised acceleration. And somewhere between statistics and memory, he chose pressure without pause. Across Europe, fronts shifted quietly. Commanders felt shortages growing sharper, and the cost would fall on crews, drivers, and cities. Stalin knew wars ended when engines failed, when replacement stopped, and when time itself turned against the enemy. In that room he felt history tighten, not with speeches or slogans, but with production lines, silence, and resolve. What followed would test endurance beyond victory, reshape decisions at the front, and reveal what Stalin truly said next. On 10 July 1945, Stalin summoned his inner circle, not for celebration, but for calculation under the heavy Kremlin ceiling. Reports from Kursk to the Vistula lay open, showing German units cannibalizing wrecks, stripping tanks for parts, delaying movement. Stalin listened as Zhukov spoke plainly. Replacements were slower, armor counts thinner. Crews rushed into machines already tired. The room felt colder as Stalin recalled German strength in earlier years, when steel seemed endless and pressure never relented. Now intelligence confirmed the truth: German factories bombed, rail lines shattered, fuel scarce, skilled labor dead or captured. Stalin leaned forward, fingers tapping softly, understanding that attrition had finally crossed an invisible line. He said the war was no longer about breakthroughs alone, but about exhaustion, about forcing Germany to spend what it could not replace. Orders followed quietly. Relentless assaults, no long pauses. Armor pushing infantry. Infantry shielding armor, day after day. At the front, Soviet commanders felt the change, resistance still fierce, but thinner, more desperate, less flexible under pressure. German crews fought bravely, yet machines failed faster than repair trucks arrived, and every loss echoed louder than before. Stalin understood this was not mercy time, it was decision time, when hesitation could allow recovery, even from ruin. He remembered how close collapse had come for the Soviet Union, how one winter nearly ended everything. That memory hardened him, turning advantage into demand, demand into orders, orders into movement across ruined ground. In Moscow the realization deepened. Germany was fighting time now, and time was no longer on its side. The Red Army would not wait for surrender. It would move until resistance broke, or nothing remained to resist. On 14 July 1945, Stalin reviewed fresh front summaries, his silence heavier than any command spoken aloud. From East Prussia to the Oder, German armored units reported machines abandoned, not destroyed by shells, but by failure. Engines seized without oil, tracks snapped beyond repair, crews burned maps, and withdrew on foot through ruined villages. Stalin absorbed this without satisfaction. Knowing collapse did not mean peace. It meant chaos before the end. He told his generals that desperation breeds resistance, and resistance still kills men, even without tanks. The Red Army was ordered forward again. Pressure constant, rhythm unbroken, forcing the enemy to react without tools. Soviet tank crews noticed fewer counterattacks, more ambushes, more infantry clinging to streets and forests. German commanders improvised with assault guns, training vehicles, anything that could fire once before dying. Stalin saw this as confirmation. Germany was no longer planning. It was surviving hour to hour. In private, he remarked that steel shortages shape destiny more reliably than speeches or flags. Factories in the Urals roared louder each night. Trains carried fresh armor west, while German rail yards lay silent. The contrast hardened Stalin's certainty. This was the moment to deny recovery completely. He warned against overconfidence, reminding officers how fragile advantage had once been for the Soviet Union. Every kilometer gained now saved blood later. Every delay allowed Germany to regroup around rubble. The war had entered its final industrial phase, where output mattered more than genius, and endurance outweighed bravery. Stalin's realization settled fully. Germany could still fight, but it could no longer rebuild itself. That difference would decide everything. Not in one battle, but across weeks of grinding advance. On 18 July 1945, Stalin received reports from Berlin's outskirts, the city trembling under constant artillery pressure. The papers spoke of German units rotating crews through burned holes, counting shells like rations, waiting for machines that never arrived. Stalin imagined Hitler's headquarters. Maps still covered in arrows, promises still spoken, but steel no longer following orders. He said quietly that wars are lost first in factories, long before flags fall from buildings. Soviet commanders were instructed to press armor forward without hesitation, exploiting gaps before makeshift defenses could harden. In the streets, German infantry fought with courage, but courage without engines could not stop massed movement. Stalin noted how resistance shifted shape. Fewer armored clashes, more barricades, mines, and desperate close combat. This told him everything. Germany was defending memory, not territory, fighting for time it no longer owned. He recalled earlier years when Soviet soldiers faced German tanks endlessly renewed, each loss replaced by another column. Now the reversal felt complete, and Stalin allowed himself one rare certainty. The enemy's strength was finite at last. Factories beyond the Urals delivered numbers Germany could not match. Production reports replacing fear with arithmetic confidence. Stalin warned his generals not to slow for symbolism. Capitals mattered less than momentum. Every hour denied Germany the chance to repair, reorganize, or bluff strength it no longer possessed. Civilian suffering mounted. Smoke rolled through streets, and Stalin accepted the cost with grim resolve. He believed hesitation would only prolong agony, making final victory more expensive in blood. As night fell over Moscow, he marked positions on the map, thinking not of speeches, but of silence in German plants. The realization had matured into policy, relentless advance. No pause for negotiation born of weakness. Germany's inability to replace its tanks was no longer intelligence. It was destiny unfolding in real time. On 22 July 1945, Stalin sat beneath the low Kremlin lights, reviewing casualty lists alongside factory output numbers. The contrast haunted him, columns of names beside columns of steel, both demanding decisions without emotion. He remarked that victory paid for itself only when pressure never slackened, and replacement never slowed. At the front, German commanders begged for armor that no longer existed, improvising defenses from rubble and resolve. Stalin understood this stage well. When belief outlives capability, and leadership hides shortages behind rhetoric, he ordered armored spearheads to keep moving. Even when roads burned, even when losses mounted, the Red Army advanced methodically, knowing each destroyed German tank was irreplaceable, each Soviet loss painful but recoverable. German crews fought fiercely, aware that survival, not success, had become their objective. Stalin reflected on 1941 again. How close his own state had come to the same fate. That memory stripped any temptation toward mercy, replacing it with urgency shaped by experience. In Moscow, intelligence confirmed factories in the Reich lay silent, bombed, evacuated, or starved of labor. Stalin said that when production dies, armies fight ghosts of their former power. He instructed commanders to treat resistance seriously, but never as proof of strength. Every stand Germany made was a withdrawal delayed, not a comeback forming. The war was narrowing now, not in geography, but in options available to Berlin. Stalin felt the end approaching, not with relief, but with the weight of responsibility. The final push would demand discipline, restraint, and ruthless momentum all at once. He knew history would not ask what Germany wanted, only what it could still do. And Germany, without tanks to replace, could only endure until endurance itself ran out. On 26 July 1945, Stalin met his marshals again. Voices low, maps crowded with red arrows pressing west. The reports confirmed what he already sensed. German counterattacks had become rare, short, and quickly exhausted. Where armored thrusts once rolled forward with confidence, now there were pauses, breakdowns, and retreat after brief contact. Stalin noted that an army without renewal fights differently, conserving shells, avoiding risk, clinging to fragments of strength. He instructed commanders to probe constantly, forcing Germany to reveal weakness everywhere at once. Soviet units advanced through towns where tanks lay abandoned, engines gutted, symbols of an industrial defeat. German soldiers still resisted fiercely, but often without coordination, without support, without hope of reinforcement. Stalin understood this was the dangerous phase, when collapse can lash out unpredictably. He warned that desperation sharpens cruelty, making civilians and prisoners more vulnerable. Orders emphasized control, discipline, and speed, preventing chaos from spreading behind the lines. Factories in the east reported record output, crews working through exhaustion, believing their labor shortened the war. Stalin saw production as a second front, quieter, but decisive in shaping the battlefield. He remarked that Germany was now paying for years of overreach, fighting a war it could no longer supply. Each kilometer gained reduced German options further, shrinking maneuver into survival. The Red Army sensed momentum, not through speeches, but through fewer shells incoming, fewer engines heard at dawn. Stalin felt the trap tightening. Not dramatic, but relentless, like pressure underwater. He knew the final months would still cost lives, perhaps more than expected. Yet the outcome no longer depended on brilliance or luck, but on endurance already decided. Germany could still fight, but it could no longer change the equation. On 30 July 1945, Stalin received late-night updates, the kind that arrive when resistance refuses to disappear quietly. German formations were dissolving into fragments, battalions acting alone, armor replaced by fear and improvisation. Stalin listened carefully, knowing collapse does not end danger. It multiplies uncertainty. He said that an army without replacement becomes a collection of final stands. Across ruined roads, Soviet tanks advanced almost uncontested. Yet snipers, mines, and ambushes took their toll. German soldiers fought knowing no relief was coming, and that knowledge hardened every corner. Stalin ordered patience paired with pressure, avoiding reckless advances that would waste lives needlessly. He reminded commanders that victory was already industrially secured. Tactically, it must be preserved. Factories still delivered fresh armor daily. The contrast with Germany now impossible to ignore. In Berlin, leadership argued over fantasies, but the front argued with silence and shortage. Stalin reflected on power, how it appears strongest when it renews itself effortlessly. Germany had lost that power long before surrender. The world simply had not noticed yet. The Red Army encountered fewer tanks, more men on foot, carrying weapons meant for delay, not victory. Stalin saw this as confirmation that the enemy's future had collapsed into the present. He spoke of finishing the war quickly, not from compassion, but from calculation shaped by loss. Every day extended meant more graves, more cities scarred beyond repair. The realization that Germany could not replace its tanks now governed every decision. It was no longer a secret, it was the engine driving the final phase forward. On 3 August 1945, Stalin reviewed the final operational maps. Their margins crowded with notes, losses, and narrowed objectives. German resistance persisted in pockets. But without armor it lacked the power to shape events beyond the next street. Stalin remarked that tanks were the spine of modern war. And Germany's spine had already broken. Soviet commanders advanced with caution, knowing desperation fights hardest in corners. Urban combat replaced maneuver. Infantry clearing ruins where engines once decided outcomes. Stalin understood this phase well. When the enemy can still kill, but can no longer win. Reports described German crews sabotaging their own machines, denying capture of the last working hulls. To Stalin this was symbolic, a nation destroying what it could no longer sustain. Factories continued sending armor west, though he now measured output by restraint rather than speed. He warned against needless sacrifice, knowing industrial advantage did not excuse carelessness. The Red Army pressed methodically, denying Germany any illusion of reversal. Stalin reflected on how quickly power evaporates once production fails. Years of conquest unraveled in weeks of shortage. He believed history would remember speeches. But victory was built by workers unseen. Germany's generals still spoke of honor, yet honor could not move steel. Each day brought quieter fronts, shorter reports, and fewer armored encounters. Stalin felt the war narrowing toward its conclusion. Not with triumph, but with inevitability. The realization that Germany could not replace its tanks had stripped the future of surprise. What remained was endurance, discipline, and the burden of finishing what industry had already decided. On 7 August 1945, Stalin received the morning summary. Thinner than before, its pages marked by absence as much as action. German armored sightings were now rare events, noted carefully, like relics of an earlier phase. Stalin observed that silence on the battlefield often speaks louder than explosions. Without replacement, German units conserved what little armor remained, hiding machines, avoiding engagement. This behavior confirmed his conclusion: the enemy feared loss more than defeat. He ordered pressure maintained everywhere, denying Germany the chance to choose where to fight. Soviet troops advanced through zones once dominated by steel, now ruled by foot soldiers and rubble. German resistance slowed movement, but no longer altered direction. Stalin reflected on how industrial war punishes those who gamble everything on momentum. Germany had gambled on speed, and now paid with immobility. Factories in the East still delivered, though Stalin now thought in terms of ending, not expanding. He spoke of restraint again, knowing unnecessary bloodshed would stain victory. The Red Army closed gaps methodically, cutting off pockets, forcing surrender or exhaustion. German soldiers increasingly surrendered, their equipment worn, their future obvious. Stalin felt the moral weight of finality, a burden heavier than uncertainty. Victory was no longer a question of if, but of how many would die before it arrived. The realization about tanks had become a larger truth about limits. No nation could outfight the collapse of its own industry. As night approached, Stalin looked at the map one last time, knowing the end was near, but not painless. On 12 August 1945, Stalin stood again before the great map. Its arrows now pressed tightly against the final margins of war. The report spoke not of advances, but of endings, units surrendering, resistance collapsing inward on itself. German armor appeared only as wreckage, burned hulls marking where strength once renewed itself endlessly. Stalin said quietly that history ends wars before soldiers do. Through shortages no courage can overcome. He felt no celebration, only confirmation of what he had known since steel stopped flowing west. The Red Army moved carefully now, minimizing loss, closing the last spaces left to fight. German soldiers laid down weapons, knowing replacement would never come, neither for machines nor for men. Stalin reflected on the cost paid since 1941. Cities lost, families erased, time stolen forever. He believed this realization about tanks had shortened the war, though it could never redeem its suffering. Factories slowed for the first time, their purpose nearly fulfilled. their noise replaced by exhaustion. Stalin understood victory not as triumph, but as survival proven through endurance. Germany's defeat had been sealed not by one battle, but by an inability to rebuild. He remarked that empires fall when production fails, regardless of belief or ideology. As the final reports arrived, he allowed himself one breath of stillness. The war had ended where it truly began, in factories, in logistics, in limits. Stalin turned from the map, knowing the future would judge him harshly. But history rarely asks permission. What he had said, and what he had decided, followed the logic of a world shaped by machines. Germany could fight no longer. Not because it lacked men, but because it lacked steel.